This is a fascinating film, and I admit I knew very little about the region in Kenya and about the plight that these people go through and the real battle that is there, violent and cultural and political. But take me through why you wanted to highlight this story on the ground of these cattle farmers and really what led you to telling this story right now.
Yeah, we think Laikipia is this remote place in Kenya, but it's just such a microcosm of what's going on in so many places around the world. And it's so topical and universal because it's a story where climate change, climate warming brings on the surface issues that have been under the surface for so long. And this isn't the case for so many other places. You know, it's not a story, it's not a climate story, the typical climate story about, flooding and migration, which audiences watch and think this is not going to happen to us ever. This is a story that I think exists in the majority of the places around the world. So, in the beginning, people watch it and like, oh, it's cattle, it's remote in Kenya. But then with the empathy that we feel that we have created for our characters and how personal these stories are, and emotional, we feel that the audience would connect and realize that it's not just a story about Laikipia, it's a story about everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I want to get to the climate change stuff, but it is so much about race and about legacy and who has the rights to this land. And I found it so layered and interesting in that regard. What was amazing to me is that you immediately sense the privilege of these white people who are not native, but they are Kenyans. They have lived there their entire lives. Their families have been there 100 years, but you absolutely feel that privilege when you see 8,000 acres, 30,000 acres, 50,000 acres. It's stunning. And then to see the opposite side of that, and then like, well, you can't even raise your cattle here. So I guess my question is, how did you grapple with that moral narrative, that dilemma of these people who have been there and feel like they have as much claim to the land and the right to it as the native Kenyans, the pastoralists who live there?
Yeah, I think we can both answer this question.
Do you want me to start? I could start and then you could pick it up. Yeah, I think, it's a complex story, and I think that's what the power of creative nonfiction is. We filmed for about 6 years in the place, on and off, and we had 2 directors, Daphne Matziaraki, who's Greek and who worked in Kenya actually 20 years ago, before the filming actually happened. So she lived in Kenya and was able to understand the dynamics of race and belonging before she ever ventured into filming. And I would just say, Kenya is a really complicated place. We've only been independent for 60 years, but issues around land, and dealing with the legacy of colonialism in Kenya, after, the British, left the country or handed over the right to govern the country to the Kenyans, a lot of questions about land were unsettled. And it's not just in Laikipia, where you have 4th generation, 5th generation white Kenyans owning a lot of land. There's other parts of the country where even other Black Kenyans from other parts of the country own vast tracts of land, and the indigenous people who are there still don't have ownership or don't have the right to be able to, graze their cattle or do what they did for centuries. So we told the story in Laikipia specifically because it's this wildlife conservation haven. That's what it's known for. And we wanted to grapple with the questions of home and belonging. Because what does that mean for someone who's there 4 generations, and they've tilled the land, for centuries, and maybe they're not directly responsible for the historical land injustice, but then the descendants of the Samburu are also, they also want to figure out how they can get back their grazing rights. So we feel like this is a question that everyone's grappling with across the world. I would say even here in America.
Yeah, it's metaphorical in a way. idea. It's about home and belonging and the understanding that we different peoples have about our identity, what is home, what belongs to us. It's two different peoples that have a very different understanding of home. You know, the Western notion of home is so tied to ownership and owning the land and putting boundaries around the land and having a steady home. And these other peoples have lived for centuries in a very different way of life, where home doesn't have these exact boundaries, and you know, they both feel connected to this place, and they both feel connected to this place in a very kind of like integral way. They're connected to the landscape, the environment, the wildlife. It's all so tied together. So these are big questions, because there are so many places where in the world where colonial legacy has been an issue. And moving forward, the conversation about how do we deal with current issues of the future is like we are so actually happy and proud for our characters that wanted to participate in this film, because they were so brave, coming into it knowing that they would have to confront. They would be part of this conversation. So,
well, I mean, I wanted to ask about that because you have, I mean, some of the white Kenyans in the film who you really earn their trust, and they're saying, I mean, there are some shocking things. They say there's this one scene where someone talks about like dropping napalm, and another one where he's confronting a Samburu and he's like, you know, telling him to get going, or, you know, it's really threatening, and it's a really tense scene. How did you get some of that trust, but you also find empathy for these people as well, and kind of their own struggles? So what were some of your challenges in that regard?
Well, you know, these are people that are caught in the front lines of a conflict, and we are all humans, and every single one of these individuals felt that they had a right to defend their right to the land and their existence and their identity there. And I feel that every single individual, if put against a wall and in a really difficult situation, we might do and say things that are not exactly appropriate. And this is part of being human. George, who said, we're gonna shoot them down with some napalm, was 19 years old when he said that. And actually, after having watched the film, he's really reflecting on himself. He feels really ashamed about what he said. And, you know, I spoke to his sister and him and his brother and his father, and who they all really, really deeply loved the film. And they said they felt that it was fair, and it was eye-opening for them, because they have never seen inside a Samburu hut, although they've shared this landscape with these people, or they've never seen the Samburu in such a light. So it was really enlightening for them. They felt amazing to see, you know, their mother coming back to life and what she represented, but also it was very self-reflective for them, as well as for Simeon, and as well as for Tom, you know, who's in a confrontation again. So we're very proud for our characters who gave us a trust and really have loved the film and embraced it and want to be part of a future conversation.
Yeah, but I think also, just to add, I also think there is that dynamic between white Kenyans and black Kenyans, whether or not you're indigenous, because of this legacy of colonialism. And there are some white Kenyans who integrate within the wider Kenyan community and mix with black Kenyans. But there's also like a subset of people where maybe they're white Kenyans and they just interact amongst themselves. And some of the behavior is problematic, you know, and it's because they're isolated in this community where it's okay to talk badly, you know, to a black Kenyan because you don't think they're in the same social status. But also the reason that we made this film was so that we can bring these two communities together, because they are so polarized. They're not talking to each other, but they share the same ecosystem. And I think what Daphne was saying about people looking at themselves, you know, seeing a mirror and understanding talking to Black Kenyans like this is wrong. Talking to another human like this is wrong. And we're hoping that, this can open up a wider conversation about like how do white Kenyans, coexist with Black Kenyans. There's a lot of things we've not said, Yeah. One of the languages in Kenya, there's a very famous Kenyan author who says we have 3 languages in Kenya, and one of them is silence, where we don't talk, and she's called Ivona War, and she's written some really seminal books about Kenyan history. And, I think for Kenya, we don't talk about many things. We'll talk as Black Kenyans and say, oh, this is how the white Kenyans are, But I think that's what makes this film so special, and that's why, we have such an incredible team that's multicultural. Daphne's from Greece, and she's a director. Pete Moremi, who unfortunately couldn't be here for personal reasons, is Kenyan. I'm the producer, I'm Kenyan. Maya Craig is from America, from the Bay Area. And we have Sam Soko, who's our editor, who's Kenyan. And then we had a consulting editor, I think, who was Spanish. Yeah. So it was such an incredible process making this film and editing over 2 years to be able to grapple with all of these things that you're talking about.
Well, what is the situation there now? Is it still a drought ongoing? And how has the violence escalated or not? Or where did things stand?
Yeah, so, our film, in a way, doesn't have this kind of like clear ending. It's the end of a cycle. It's the end of a rain cycle, and a drought cycle, rather. We end this film with Simeon saying it's the end of the cycle. It's some time to kind of regroup and think and see how we move forward. Unfortunately, the droughts are getting worse. And the rains are getting more disrupted, less frequent, heavier. And that's really problematic for every single member of each community of this mosaic, Laikipia. It's really harmful to the wildlife. It's really harmful to the cattle ranchers, and of course, it's such a despair for the Samburu semi-pastoralist communities, semi-nomadic pastoralist communities. So. It's not getting any better. The weather is not getting any better. Climate change is here, and it's here to stay, I think, for all of us. So right now, the rains have come. There's a lot of flooding, which is very damaging, and the drought is expected again to come. So unless people come on the same table from an equal position to try to find ways to move forward, the situation is not going to improve.